The probate courtroom was so quiet I could hear the old brass clock ticking above the judge's bench when Laura finally realized what she had done to herself. She had walked in expecting an inheritance hearing. She walked into a fraud proceeding. Mr. Whitmore had testified under oath that my Limoges wedding china had not been discarded as Laura claimed, but consigned under false authority and sold for $18,000, with every cent traced into her private account. The bank records spoke louder than excuses ever could. The appraisal records proved she had known the set's value. The emails showed she had instructed the auction house to keep the sale hidden from me. What Laura thought was a harmless deception had become financial exploitation in the eyes of the court. Her attorney asked for leniency. The judge was unmoved. Laura was ordered to repay the full proceeds with penalties, legal costs, and interest. But money was the smallest part of what she lost. Because when my attorney presented the amended family trust, the room changed. Laura's face drained of color as she learned she had been permanently removed as successor trustee and disinherited from every discretionary asset she had spent years circling. The lake cottage she expected one day to own had already been transferred into a preservation trust for my grandchildren. The brokerage account she assumed would pass to her was pledged to a scholarship fund in my late husband's name. Even the family home, the one she once hinted should be sold because I was too old to manage it, was protected beyond her reach. She had stolen $18,000 and lost a future worth more than $2 million. But the real reckoning came after the hearing, when members of our church board, neighbors, and relatives who had heard her stories about me finally saw the court filings for themselves. Her reputation, carefully polished over decades, cracked in a single afternoon. People stopped calling her generous. They started calling her what she had been: opportunistic. My daughter looked at me in the hallway afterward, tears in her eyes, and asked how I could do this to my own child. I looked at her the way a mother looks when illusions have burned away. I told her, "I did not do this to you, Laura. You sold your mother's history and called it practicality. You priced my trust at $18,000. The court only calculated the interest." Then I handed her a small velvet-lined box. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a single porcelain teacup from the original set, the one piece I had quietly kept all along. On the bottom was my grandmother's faded mark. I told her this was the only piece she would ever touch again. Not because it was worth money, but because she had proven she did not understand value. Months later, I stood in a packed auction gallery, not as a victim but as honored consignor, when another heirloom from my family collection sold to applause for a record price, the proceeds funding the scholarship trust. Mr. Whitmore smiled and whispered that some collections appreciate after surviving neglect. I smiled back because he was no longer talking about porcelain. When I returned home that evening, I set that lone teacup in the center of my dining cabinet beneath a soft light. Not as a reminder of betrayal, but as proof that what is precious does not become worthless because someone greedy says so. Laura lost the money, the inheritance, and the standing she spent a lifetime building. I kept the house, the legacy, and the final word. She thought she sold my china. What she really auctioned away was her claim to everything that would have been hers. "No one wants your old china, Mom," my daughter said, lifting a porcelain plate as if it weighed nothing, as if 40 years of family holidays could be measured in ounces and dismissed in a breath. I believed her for exactly 6 days. On the 7th, I saw my wedding china in an auction catalog estimated at $15,000 to $20,000. That was the morning I understood my daughter had not underestimated my inheritance. She had priced it. The cabinet in my dining room looked strangely hollow after Laura and her husband carried the boxes out. For 2 days I avoided looking at the empty shelves. I told myself she was probably right. Times changed. Young people didn't want formal china. Nobody hosted 12 for Sunday roast anymore. People ate from stoneware bought online and called it minimalist. I repeated those things because they hurt less than admitting I had let go of the one thing my mother placed in my hands on my wedding day. The set was French Limoges, hand-painted ivy borders, gold rims worn thin where generations of fingers had touched them. My late husband used to joke we owned the fanciest mashed potatoes in Ohio. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas Eve, every christening meal had passed across those plates. They were memory disguised as porcelain. But Laura stood in my kitchen last Tuesday, coffee in hand, sounding practical. Honestly, Mom, antique dealers can barely give that stuff away. She said it the way children correct old people about smartphones. Kindly, efficiently, final. At 72, you start noticing when people use the tone reserved for those they think are fading. I heard it and ignored it. That afternoon I signed a simple release, so she could donate the set. Or so I believed. The following Sunday I drove to the library because mine had closed for renovations, and while waiting for a genealogy book, I picked up a regional auction catalog from a side table. The cover showed silver tea services and Victorian furniture. I nearly put it back. Then I saw the photograph. 12 dinner plates. The ivy border. My mother's china. My hands went cold before my mind caught up. Lot 214. Estate porcelain service. Estimated $15,000 to $20,000. Consigned by private family collection. I read those words 3 times. There are moments in life when betrayal does not arrive as shouting or cruelty. It arrives as a quiet sentence printed on glossy paper. I took the catalog to the window for better light, as if sunlight might prove I was mistaken. But there was the small flaw on one platter, a pale line near the rim where my son dropped a serving spoon in 1986. I knew every inch of that set. And suddenly other memories shifted. Laura insisting on helping me sort valuables after Harold died. Laura asking where the silver was insured. Laura once laughing that sentimental things only matter until someone names a price. My chest tightened, though not from grief. From recognition. Someone had been arranging pieces on a board while I thought we were merely cleaning cabinets. I drove home slower than usual, the catalog folded beside me like evidence. The empty dining cabinet no longer looked sad. It looked like a crime scene. That night Laura called and asked if I'd missed the china. I said only, not as much as someone may miss the truth. She laughed softly, not understanding. I let her. Some games reveal themselves only when the wrong person assumes the old woman at the table is no longer paying attention. And by then, I had already decided I would find out who had sold my history and what else they believed I would never notice. The next morning I made coffee before dawn and sat at Harold's old oak desk with the auction catalog open beside his brass reading lamp. Rain tapped against the kitchen windows in a slow, patient rhythm, and for the first time since Harold died, the silence in the house did not feel lonely. It felt useful. I studied Lot 214 the way Harold used to study tax returns when something did not add up. There was an auction number, a gallery name in Cincinnati, and a preview date 3 days away. I circled each one in pencil. At 7:30, Laura called as she always did on Mondays. Her voice was light, almost cheerful. She asked whether I had remembered to take my blood pressure medicine. She asked whether the plumber had fixed the upstairs sink. Then she said, too casually, I hope you're enjoying all that extra cabinet space. I looked at the empty shelves before answering. It is surprising, I said, what empty spaces can reveal. She laughed again. I noticed she often laughed when she was uncertain. That had always been her tell. After we hung up, I opened the hall closet where Harold kept old insurance folders. I was looking for appraisal papers from years ago, but what I found unsettled me more. A file marked household valuables had been disturbed. Pages were out of order. A silver inventory sheet was missing. I sat back slowly. The china might not be the beginning. It might only be what I had finally noticed. By noon I drove to see Margaret Sloan, my oldest friend, who still ran a small antique booth outside town and knew more about old porcelain than most museums. She put on white cotton gloves before touching the catalog and did not speak for nearly a minute. Then she looked over her glasses and said, Evelyn, this estimate is conservative. If complete, that set could bring more. I heard no outrage in her voice, only certainty. Somehow that was worse. I asked whether an auction house would disclose who consigned it. She gave me a long look. If fraud is involved, they might. Then she leaned closer. What are you not telling me? I told her enough. Not everything. Saying it aloud made it feel too real. On the drive home, memories kept surfacing in fragments I had once dismissed. Laura offering to store family silver after a roof leak that never happened. Laura insisting Harold had wanted her to help manage my paperwork, though Harold had never said such a thing. Laura once asking whether old things should be sold before probate complications. At the time it sounded practical. Now every sentence had edges. That evening I stood in front of the china cabinet again and touched the polished wood where generations of hands had opened those doors. I remember my mother telling me when she gave me the set, "Beautiful things survive because someone protects them." I had thought she meant porcelain. Perhaps she meant trust. Later that night, I called the auction gallery and asked about preview hours. The young man on the phone said the public was welcome. I wrote down the address. Cincinnati was 92 miles away. Less than 2 hours if traffic behaved. When I hung up, I did not feel wounded. I felt awake. Somewhere in that gallery, under polished lights and numbered placards, sat proof that my daughter had lied to my face. But I was beginning to suspect the china was only one thread, and if I pulled carefully enough, the whole hidden ledger of what had been taken might begin to unravel. Friday arrived gray and cold, with a kind of Midwestern drizzle that makes every highway mile feel longer. I left before sunrise with the auction catalog folded in my handbag and Harold's old driving gloves in the passenger seat, though I no longer needed gloves to grip a steering wheel. Some habits survived the people who gave them meaning. The gallery sat in a converted brick warehouse near the river, elegant in the restrained way old money often is. Inside, polished cases gleamed beneath soft lights, and collectors moved quietly from table to table, speaking in numbers and provenance. No one noticed the widow in sensible shoes studying porcelain with the intensity of a prosecutor. Then I saw it. My china. Set beneath a placard that reduced decades of family history to a lot number. 12 dinner plates, serving bowls, coffee pot, cream pitcher, every piece arranged with museum precision. For a moment I forgot to breathe. I stepped closer, and there it was, the pale line near the platter rim where my son had dropped the spoon all those years ago. Not similar.
Mine.
I asked the attendant whether the consignor was local. He smiled politely and said that information was confidential. But when I mentioned I believed the property may have been consigned without the owner's knowledge, his expression shifted. He disappeared into a back office and returned with a silver-haired man in a navy suit who introduced himself as Charles Whitmore. His handshake was dry and deliberate. He listened without interruption while I explained how the set had left my home under false pretenses. When I finished, he looked at the china, then back at me. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "there may be documentation we need to review." He invited me into his office, where walls lined with auction catalogs made me feel as if generations of secrets had been appraised there. He pulled a consignment file from a cabinet and, after a long pause that seemed almost moral rather than procedural, turned the document toward me. The consignor name was Laura Bennett. My daughter's signature ran in blue ink across the page. Under seller instructions she had written, "Family heirloom from my late father's estate." My late father. As though Harold had belonged to her alone. As though I were already gone. Then came the blow beneath the blow. Mr. Whitmore pointed to a recent transfer receipt. Advance proceeds already dispersed. $8,000. The rest due after sale. I heard myself ask whether this was legal. He answered carefully. If ownership was misrepresented, that is another matter. There are remedies. Remedies. Such a civilized word for betrayal. I left his office carrying photocopies he should perhaps not have given me. Outside, rain had stopped. The pavement shone silver. I sat in my car, but did not start the engine. Instead, I unfolded the receipts again. Laura had not made a desperate mistake. She had arranged a transaction. Planned it. Profited from it. As I stared at her signature, another memory surfaced sharp as broken glass. 2 years earlier, Harold's pocket watch had gone missing after Laura offered to inventory keepsakes for insurance. We blamed ourselves. Then the missing silver inventory sheet from the closet returned to mind. The ledger was widening. By the time I drove home, something inside me had cooled into discipline. I did not call Laura. I did not accuse. I set the photocopies beside Harold's lamp and made a list. Attorney, bank statements, probate records. Insurance schedules. If she believed an old woman would respond with tears, she had mistaken age for weakness. Because in that auction office, under fluorescent lights and legal forms, my grief had changed shape. It had become evidence. Saturday morning, Laura arrived with cinnamon rolls from the bakery she always brought when she wanted to perform affection. I watched her set the white box on my kitchen counter as though nothing in the world had shifted. Her hair was pinned up carelessly, her smile easy, her wedding ring catching light when she reached for coffee cups. If I had not seen her signature in blue ink, I might have believed her innocence myself. That was the unsettling part. Betrayal rarely looks villainous at close range. It looks familiar. We sat at the kitchen table where she had once helped my grandchildren frost Christmas cookies, and she asked whether I had plans for Easter. I said perhaps I was thinking of reviewing my estate papers. The pause that followed was slight, almost invisible, but I saw it. Her hand stilled on the coffee mug. Then came the practiced concern. Mom, you do not need to burden yourself with all that legal stuff. Daniel and I can help when the time comes. When the time comes. As though my life were already being organized into an afterthought. I smiled and asked whether she remembered Harold's pocket watch. She frowned, too quickly. I have not thought about that in years. Strange, I said.
I have.
She changed the subject. Another tell. After she left, I opened the cedar chest in the den where Harold kept old correspondence. Beneath tax folders and yellowed deeds, I found something I had forgotten entirely, a handwritten memorandum from our attorney drafted after Harold's first heart scare. It listed certain heirlooms intended to remain outside any ordinary estate division, among them the Limoges china, the Georgian silver, the pocket watch. Family heritage articles, Harold had called them. Not assets to liquidate. Legacy to preserve. I sat with that paper in my lap for a long time. Laura had not merely sold dishes. She had crossed a line Harold had drawn before either of us imagined such a line would matter. Monday I met with an attorney named Richard Hale, a quiet man with rimless glasses and a habit of letting silence do part of the work. He studied the consignment papers, then asked whether I had authorized any sale.
No.
Had Laura held power of attorney?
No.
Had proceeds been disclosed to me?
No.
He folded his hands and said, Mrs. Carter, this may be more serious than a family misunderstanding. I felt no triumph hearing that. Only confirmation. Then he asked a question I had not considered. Do you know whether this is the first item sold without your consent? The room seemed to narrow. I told him about the missing silver inventory, Harold's watch, Laura's growing involvement in my paperwork.
He made notes slow and neat.
Then he suggested something unexpected. Do not confront her yet. Let her continue believing she controls the narrative. People reveal more when they feel safe. On the drive home, I stopped at the bank and requested statements going back 3 years. The young teller printed them with cheerful indifference, unaware she was handing me the archaeology of trust. That evening, turning pages at my dining table, I found a wire transfer I did not recognize from a brokerage account Harold once used. It had been redirected 18 months earlier to an account co-managed under Laura's advisory authority, something I barely remembered signing after a hospitalization. My pulse thudded in my ears. The china had opened a door, but behind it stood a hallway of shadows I had not yet explored. When darkness settled outside the windows, I walked to the empty cabinet and ran my hand across polished wood. I no longer saw absence there. I saw bait. Because for the first time, I understood this was no longer about recovering porcelain. It was about allowing a woman who mistook kindness for decline to continue believing I was still asleep while I quietly prepared to wake the entire house. 2 days later, Richard Hale called just after breakfast and asked whether I could come downtown. His tone was measured, but there was something beneath it, the restrained gravity of a man who had found what he expected and wished he had not. I drove in wearing the navy coat Harold bought me on our 40th anniversary, though I did not know why that felt important. Perhaps because some battles require arriving dressed as the person you still are. Richard spread bank records across his conference table in neat rows, each marked with yellow tabs. He pointed to transfers I had missed for years because they were small enough not to alarm, $500 here, $1,200 there, framed as advisory fees, storage expenses, estate management reimbursements. The language was almost elegant in its deceit. Then he showed me one transfer for $24,000 moved 18 months ago from an income account Harold established for my long-term care. Authorized under advisory convenience. My signature appeared on the form, but even I could see the stroke was hesitant, copied from another document. I stared until the room blurred. Richard did not dramatize it. He only said, "This may establish a pattern."
Pattern.
Again, a civilized word for theft. On the drive home, I did not turn on the radio. I let memory fill the silence instead. Laura insisting after my hospital stay that paperwork exhausted me. Laura, bringing folders already flagged with yellow stickers where I should sign. Laura saying, "Let me make life simpler for you, Mom." I had mistaken management for devotion. At home, I found a message from Laura asking whether I wanted to join them Sunday for brunch. I replied yes at once. If she was building a stage, I intended to let her finish decorating it. That afternoon, I met Margaret at her antique booth and told her more than I had told anyone. She listened while polishing an old silver frame, then said something that stayed with me. Greed always overreaches, Evelyn. It does not stop where it should. It keeps leaving fingerprints. Before I left, she handed me a name of a forensic accountant she trusted. By Wednesday, his review confirmed something even Richard had not yet seen. Proceeds from the China advance and several advisory transfers had flowed through the same personal account Laura used for remodeling payments on her lake house. My daughter had funded granite countertops with family heritage. I should have felt rage. Instead, I felt a kind of stillness, so complete it frightened me. Because anger burns fast. Clarity endures. That evening, Laura called to complain, almost jokingly, that contractors always cost more than expected. I listened while she described imported tile for a breakfast nook. I imagined my mother's porcelain financing her backsplash. Then she asked whether I had made progress reviewing estate papers. I said yes, more than you would imagine. Silence. Just long enough. At brunch Sunday, she wore cream linen and kissed my cheek. Daniel poured mimosas. Their dining room looked out over the lake, sunlight flashing off water, as though the world approved of them. Laura mentioned rising property taxes and laughed that someday this house would all be mine to maintain. I said perhaps not. She looked at me, curious, but the conversation moved on. I noticed, near the hallway, a framed architectural rendering of a planned addition labeled conservatory. Estimated cost penciled at $82,000. I wondered how much of my future she had already budgeted. Driving home, I understood something had shifted in the story I thought I was living. This was no longer mother against daughter over an heirloom. It was evidence accumulating toward reckoning. And while Laura still believed she was arranging outcomes, she did not yet know I had begun arranging witnesses. The following week, Richard Hale proposed something I had not considered.
"Do not stop the auction," he said.
Let the sale proceed. Let the transaction complete under observation. Greed often becomes careless at the moment it believes victory is secure. There was something almost surgical in the advice, and I recognized Harold would have approved. He always said truth ripens under patience. So I agreed. The china sold on Saturday afternoon for $18,000 and drew applause from collectors who admired craftsmanship they did not know had once held Thanksgiving gravy in suburban Ohio. Mr. Whitmore sent the final transfer records Monday morning. The remaining proceeds had landed exactly where the forensic accountant predicted, into Laura's account, then partially routed to a contractor. Evidence no longer depended on inference. It sat in statements, timestamps, signatures. That should have brought relief. Instead, it brought a colder realization. If Laura believed she had succeeded, she might reach further. Richard arranged for revised estate documents to be drafted quietly. New trust protections. Successor trustees changed. Asset restrictions strengthened. But he suggested something more daring. Invite Laura into a conversation about family legacy. Let her reveal how much she assumes belongs to her.
So I did.
I called and asked whether she would help me review Harold's old keepsakes for a possible family exhibit at church. Her enthusiasm came too quickly.
Of course, Mom.
You know I care about preserving family history. I nearly admired the fluency of it. That Thursday she arrived with notepads and color tabs, as if preparing a museum archive. We spread items across my dining table: silver frames, war medals, Harold's fountain pen. Laura picked up a small carved ivory letter opener and casually asked whether it had been appraised. Casual, always casual. I answered that I had recently updated all valuations. Her eyes lifted, only for a
second.
There was again that flicker between interest and alarm. Later she wandered into the den and paused before Harold's locked roll-top desk. I had left the key visible on purpose. She touched it, then withdrew her hand when she saw me watching. We spent 2 hours sorting memories while she asked increasingly practical questions disguised as sentiment. Which accounts fund house maintenance? Whether the Lake Cottage deed had transfer provisions? Whether I had considered simplifying ownership while I was healthy? Every question polished. Every one recorded in my mind. After she left, I opened the desk and removed a second heirloom I had told no one about, a Tiffany tea service from Harold's grandmother wrapped in tarnished cloth. I had nearly forgotten it existed. Richard smiled when he saw it the next day. Sometimes, he said, the strongest leverage is what greed has not discovered yet. That phrase stayed with me, because an idea had begun taking shape, not merely to defend what remained, but to let Laura expose herself publicly through the appetite she believed hidden. Meanwhile, Daniel called unexpectedly and asked whether I had spoken to Laura about inheritance timing. The wording startled me. Timing. As if succession were a scheduling issue. I answered lightly that surprises often come late in life. He chuckled uneasy. Even his unease sounded like evidence. Sunday after church, I stood beside Margaret in the fellowship hall while Laura charmed parishioners near the pie table, laughing, touching elbows, performing generosity. Margaret leaned toward me and whispered, "She does not know she is already standing in the story people will later retell." I looked at my daughter beneath stained glass light and understood the battlefield had shifted once again. We were no longer tracing theft. We were constructing a test. And somewhere between the revised trust, the hidden tea service, and Laura's growing confidence, I sensed the trap had begun closing without a sound. By early October, the map of what Laura had taken was clearer than I ever imagined possible, but Richard kept reminding me that evidence alone does not reveal character as fully as temptation does. That was when we set the second stage. Through Mr. Whitmore, I arranged for a private appraisal event at the auction gallery under the pretense that I was considering consigning a newly discovered family silver service. I mentioned it to Laura over lunch as though speaking too freely. I said I had found something Harold's grandmother left hidden away, perhaps worth enough to fund a scholarship in his name. I watched her reaction over chicken salad and iced tea. She froze only a heartbeat, then leaned forward with bright concern and asked whether I had already decided what to do with it. I said no, not yet. Her voice softened. Mom, family treasures should stay in the family. Sometimes greed reveals itself most clearly when it pretends to defend tradition. 2 days later, she called asking whether she might accompany me to the appraisal, saying she wanted to learn more about our heritage. I agreed at once. At the gallery, the Tiffany tea service sat under velvet lights, each piece reflecting silver-blue shadows. Mr. Whitmore, magnificent in discretion, gave a measured estimate of $110,000. Laura inhaled sharply, though she tried to hide it. He explained that provenance made it exceptional. I said perhaps I should donate it eventually. Laura touched my wrist and said, almost tenderly, "You should be careful who you trust with something so valuable." The irony nearly made me smile. Then came the test Richard had designed. Mr. Whitmore mentioned, as if casually, that private advance arrangements could sometimes be made before auction if a family representative held authorization. I said nothing. Laura said too much. She asked what documentation such authorization required. Not whether it should happen. What paperwork? I felt the room change. Even Mr. Whitmore seemed to notice. Afterward, in the parking lot, Laura suggested maybe it would be safer if she helped oversee the piece, given my age and all the legal complexities. My age, again offered as leverage. I thanked her and said I would consider it. That evening Richard called, laughing softly in disbelief. Mr. Whitmore had recorded the consultation notes in detail. Laura had practically volunteered her intent. But what neither of us expected came the next morning. My bank fraud investigator phoned to report a recent inquiry had been made regarding authority over the trust amendment paperwork, initiated from a number linked to Daniel's office. Someone was probing whether my protections could be challenged. They were moving sooner than we thought. Richard reacted instantly. He accelerated filing of the amended trust and scheduled a family luncheon under the guise of estate planning disclosures, inviting not only Laura and Daniel but my grandson, Margaret, Richard himself, and even Reverend Collins from church, whose scholarship committee would be named in the new trust. Witnesses, Richard said, do not merely observe outcomes. They shape them. The night before the luncheon, I slept unexpectedly well. Not because I knew I would win, but because I no longer feared what truth might cost. I stood before the empty china cabinet before bed and noticed my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, but not diminished. There was a steadiness in that woman I had not seen in years. The next morning Laura arrived in pearl earrings and confidence, carrying a lemon tart as though attending a celebration she expected to control. She kissed my cheek and whispered, "Whatever you decide today, Mom, I only want what is best for the family." I looked at her and thought how often betrayal borrows the language of care. Then Richard laid a sealed envelope beside my plate and nodded almost imperceptibly. Inside was the final audit summary and a second document I had not yet seen. A petition prepared for civil recovery, already signed. In that moment, I understood the test was over. What came next would not measure greed. It would expose it. Richard began the luncheon by speaking in the mild, almost tedious tone lawyers use when they want people to underestimate the danger in a room. He reviewed trust updates, charitable intentions, and succession mechanics while Laura nodded with polished attentiveness, her lemon tart untouched beside her plate. Daniel leaned back with an expression too relaxed to be genuine. My grandson Ethan looked confused but curious. Reverend Collins folded his hands and listened. Then Richard opened the sealed envelope and placed 3 documents side by side on the dining table where my wedding china once stood. First came the forensic accounting summary. He spoke calmly, tracing unauthorized transfers, advisory diversions, and the auction proceeds from the porcelain sale. Laura smiled at first, the smile people wear when they assume misunderstanding will soon be corrected. It faded when Richard slid photocopies of her consignment agreement toward her. Her signature in blue ink seemed louder than any accusation. Daniel straightened. Ethan stared at his mother as if seeing a stranger emerge through familiar skin. Laura laughed once, brittle and breathless, and said there had to be some confusion. Richard did not argue. He only placed the second document before her, a civil recovery petition prepared for filing if restitution were refused. For the first time all afternoon, silence became heavier than speech. Then came the third document, the one I had not seen until that morning. Richard announced the new Carter Heritage Trust. The Lake Cottage transferred out of ordinary inheritance. The scholarship endowment funded. The family home protected. Successor control removed from Laura permanently. Her fork slipped against china and made a sharp sound that seemed to cut the room. She turned to me with eyes wide not from sorrow but disbelief. "You changed everything without telling me." I answered softly, "You changed everything first." But Richard was not finished. He asked whether anyone present wished to hear the appraisal valuation of the Tiffany tea service. Laura said nothing. Mr. Whitmore, attending by invitation I had not disclosed, stepped from the den carrying a portfolio and confirmed the estimate publicly. $110,000. Then he added, with perfect restraint, that during appraisal Laura had inquired about authority to arrange advance disposition. The words landed with surgical precision. It was not accusation anymore. It was pattern. Daniel muttered something under his breath and pushed back his chair. Ethan stood abruptly and walked to the window, unable to look at his mother. Reverend Collins closed his eyes as if in prayer. Laura's face hardened then, the mask dropping not into remorse but anger. She accused Richard of manipulation, me of humiliation, everyone of betrayal. Strange how quickly the guilty adopt the language of victims. I let her speak until her outrage exhausted itself. Then I opened a small velvet box and set a single porcelain teacup in front of her, the one surviving piece I had kept hidden.
Her gaze fixed on it.
I told her this was the only part of that inheritance she would ever touch again. Not because I was cruel, but because she had mistaken possession for entitlement. Then I offered terms. Full repayment, legal costs, written resignation from any advisory authority, or Richard would file before sunset. Daniel looked at the petition and understood before Laura did that this was no family argument to outtalk. It was a closing gate. She whispered, "You planned all this." I said no. I simply stopped ignoring what you planned. At that moment, something remarkable happened. Laura reached for the trust papers as though to challenge them, then withdrew her hand. She knew. The room knew. The performance had ended. Yet even then the true reversal was still ahead, because Richard leaned toward me and quietly said the county investigator reviewing elder financial exploitation had agreed to meet Monday. Civil recovery was only one path. There could be another. I looked at Laura sitting beneath the family portrait she once assumed would watch her inherit everything, and realized she had come to lunch expecting a future. She was leaving with terms. Laura did not sign that afternoon. She gathered her handbag with trembling composure, said she needed time to speak with counsel, and left without touching the lemon tart she had brought, as though sweetness could survive what had happened. Daniel followed in silence. When the door closed, the house seemed to exhale. Ethan remained at the window long after their car disappeared and finally asked me whether his mother had really been taking from me for years. I told him some people do not begin by stealing money. They begin by believing what belongs to others will someday be theirs anyway. He nodded as though hearing something older than our family. Monday morning, Richard and I met the county investigator, a woman named Judith Mercer, whose questions were so precise they made sentiment irrelevant. She did not care about family dramas. She cared about authorization records, forged signatures, concealed proceeds.
Facts.
By noon, Laura's attorney called offering immediate repayment of the $18,000 plus advisory transfers if I agreed not to escalate the matter. Richard listened, took notes, and asked whether his client also intended to resign from all fiduciary claims. There was a long pause. By evening, Laura herself called. Her voice had lost its practiced smoothness. She said she had made mistakes, that Daniel had encouraged risky decisions, that none of it was meant to hurt me. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked one question. When you signed the auction consignment and deposited the advance, what exactly did you think I would never discover? She had no answer. Silence can indict more deeply than confession. 2 days later, she signed the restitution agreement. Full repayment, legal fees, formal relinquishment of advisory authority. But what surprised me was what happened next. News did not spread through scandal. It spread through disappointment. Reverend Collins quietly removed Laura from the scholarship board she had hoped to chair. The church women who once praised her fundraisers stopped calling. A neighbor I had known 30 years mentioned in the grocery aisle that people were talking about the auction business. Reputation, I learned, does not collapse in a thunderclap. It erodes in whispers. Then came Daniel. He arrived alone one rainy evening, hat in hand like a man visiting a widow in an older century. He admitted he had known about the China sale after the fact and had looked away because he believed inheritance would smooth everything over eventually. His honesty was late, but unvarnished. I asked whether he had authorized the trust inquiry from his office. He lowered his eyes. Yes. I told him lateness does not turn truth into courage. But I appreciated hearing it spoken. Before leaving, he handed me a folder. Contractor invoices for the lake house renovation, including payments tied to Laura's account. More fingerprints, as Margaret would say. Richard smiled when he reviewed them. Over each again. Meanwhile, the civil petition remained ready and signed but alive, and Laura knew it. That knowledge altered every conversation. She no longer spoke to me as custodian of her future. She spoke as someone negotiating terms with the person she had underestimated. Weeks later, at the scholarship launch reception, I stood beside Reverend Collins as he announced the Carter Heritage Fund before a room of donors and former students. Harold's name was spoken with honor. My grandson Ethan helped unveil the plaque. And across the room, near the back, Laura stood quietly alone. She had asked to attend. I had allowed it. Not from softness. From symmetry. Let her witness what greed had nearly dismantled now turned into something larger than inheritance. As guests applauded, Ethan leaned toward me and whispered that grandfather would have been proud. I believed him. Yet even with restitution secured and her standing fractured, one matter remained unresolved. Richard called the next morning to say the probate judge had scheduled a formal hearing on the trust challenge Laura's attorney had attempted before withdrawing it. A hearing now likely to end in public record. I looked at the lone porcelain teacup in my cabinet and understood the story still had one final room to enter, and in that room, the last illusion Laura possessed would not survive. The probate hearing took place on a wind-bright Thursday in November, in a courtroom older than any of our grievances, where dark wood benches seemed to absorb generations of human miscalculation. Laura arrived in a charcoal suit I had seen her wear to charity galas, as if dignity could be tailored. Her attorney made one final attempt to argue confusion, informal family understandings, unintended overreach. But Judith Mercer's investigative report had transformed family conflict into documented conduct. The forged advisory form. The concealed proceeds. The trust inquiry from Daniel's office. The contractor invoices tied to diverted funds. Each fact entered the record with a quietness more devastating than accusation. When Richard presented Harold's memorandum protecting heritage assets outside ordinary inheritance, even Laura's attorney lowered his pen. Then came a moment I had not expected. The judge asked Laura directly whether she disputed signing the auction consignment knowing the property was represented as hers to convey. For several seconds, she did not answer. I watched the woman who had always filled silence with confidence meet a silence she could not manage. Finally, she said no. One syllable. Small as a pin. Heavy as a verdict. The judge's ruling was almost clinical. The amended trust stood in full. Laura's challenge was dismissed with prejudice. Her fiduciary claims were extinguished. The restitution agreement was incorporated into enforceable order. And because the court found evidence of misrepresentation affecting a vulnerable elder's assets, the judge referred the matter for regulatory review of any future fiduciary appointments involving Laura. It was not prison, not spectacle, but something colder for a woman who built influence through trust. Formal disqualification. Public record. Consequence. Outside the courtroom, Laura asked to speak with me alone. We stood beneath stone columns where November air smelled faintly of rain and old leaves. She asked whether there was any path back. I told her paths back begin with truth, not entitlement. Then I gave her something I had carried in my handbag since dawn, a photocopy of Harold's note in his own handwriting. Protect what carries memory. Do not surrender legacy to convenience. I said he wrote that long before he knew it would become instruction. She read it and began to cry, not dramatically, but with the bewilderment of someone meeting the cost of her own logic. I felt sadness then, but no uncertainty. Some forgiveness can exist without restoration. That evening Richard brought a bottle of sparkling cider to my house, and we sat in the dining room where the empty cabinet no longer looked accusatory. He said most clients pursue revenge and call it justice. You pursued structure. I laughed and told him I pursued sleep. Weeks later, the regulatory notice became final. Laura resigned from 2 nonprofit boards before removal proceedings could begin. Daniel sold the Lake House Edition plans. Ethan began visiting every Sunday, learning family recipes once served on porcelain, now gone except for one teacup glowing beneath cabinet light. And then came the invitation that felt almost poetic. Mr. Whitmore asked whether I would be guest of honor at a winter auction showcasing American family collections. I attended in blue silk and watched the Tiffany tea service sell above estimate, every dollar funding the scholarship trust. When applause rose, Mr. Whitmore leaned over and whispered, "Some legacies grow stronger after attempted theft." Driving home that night, city lights blurring on wet roads, I realized Laura had once believed value was what something could bring at sale.
$18,000.
A number. But what she lost had no auction estimate. Control of inheritance. Standing in community. Trust of her son. And what I regained was larger still. Authority. Protection.
Peace.
Yet there remained one final act I had quietly arranged, not for punishment, but for completion. On New Year's Day, the family would gather at my home for the first reading of the Carter Heritage Trust Charter, and in it was one clause no one but Richard and I yet knew. A clause that would determine who, after me, would hold stewardship of everything Laura once assumed would pass through her hands. Snow had fallen overnight on New Year's Day, covering the yard in a silence, so clean it made the old house seem suspended outside ordinary time. I rose early to polish the silver coffee service and place the lone porcelain teacup in the center of the dining cabinet where winter light caught its rim. By noon the family began arriving, boots leaving wet prints across the foyer, voices carrying cautious warmth. Ethan came first, carrying bread from the bakery Harold loved. Margaret arrived with cranberry cake. Even Laura came, quieter than I had ever seen her, dressed plainly, almost deliberately without armor. There was no false brightness in her now, only restraint. We gathered around the same table where months earlier Richard had laid out evidence that split. Illusion from fact. This time he stood again, but with a leather folio embossed Carter Heritage Trust. His voice moved through provisions most had already heard: scholarship, stewardship, preservation covenants, charitable distributions. Then he reached the clause no one but he and I had known. Upon my death or incapacity, stewardship authority over the Carter Heritage Trust would not pass by bloodline priority, nor by former succession assumptions, but by appointment to the family member judged by independent trustees to have best demonstrated fiduciary integrity and preservation of family legacy. Richard paused and looked toward Ethan. Effective immediately, subject to co-trust mentorship, Ethan Carter Bennett was named successor steward. For a moment no one moved. Ethan stared as if hearing a language not meant for him. Laura closed her eyes. Daniel exhaled audibly. Then something extraordinary happened. Laura stood and, in front of everyone, walked to her son and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her voice trembled but held. She said, "Your grandfather would have chosen better than I did. Do not repeat me." There was no defense in it.
No bargaining.
Only admission. I had imagined many endings to this long season, but not humility spoken without being forced. After lunch, Ethan asked why I chose him when he was still so young. I told him stewardship is not age. It is what you do when no one is watching and something valuable is vulnerable. He nodded with a seriousness beyond his years. Later, as guests drifted into the parlor, Laura lingered by the cabinet studying the single teacup. She asked whether I had always planned to keep one piece hidden. I said no. I kept it the day I realized some things survive precisely because they are not surrendered all at once. She touched the glass, but did not open the cabinet. That restraint meant more to me than apology. Before leaving, she handed me an envelope. Inside was a cashier's check covering not only every dollar owed beyond the restitution order, but an additional gift to the scholarship fund in Harold's name. On the memo line, she had written restoration. I did not speak for a long moment. Then I told her consequences had taught what comfort never could. She wept quietly and kissed my cheek as she left. Not theatrically, like a daughter again. Weeks later, the first scholarship recipient was announced, a nursing student whose mother had worked 2 jobs to keep her in school. Ethan presented the award. Laura sat in the second row and applauded until her hands reddened. People who once whispered now spoke of the family trust as a model for protecting elder assets. Richard joked my case should be taught in law school. Mr. Whitmore sent a framed auction catalog page of the China sale with a note reading provenance restored. I placed it in Harold's study. And one winter evening, alone in the dining room, I looked at the cabinet, the trust charter, the scholarship letters, and understood something that $18,000 could never measure. Laura had lost what greed always loses, easy access to what was never hers. But she had also been given something harder to win back, the chance to rebuild character under consequence. I had regained full control, preserved every major asset, exposed the deception in public record, shifted legacy to safer hands, and transformed attempted theft into enduring purpose. Harold's house remained mine. His name funded futures. The woman once told no one wanted her china had outlived every false valuation placed upon her. And in the quiet that followed, I realized there was no unfinished business left in this house. Only legacy finally in the right hands. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the final public accounting of everything Laura once thought could remain buried in family silence. The regulatory review concluded with a formal finding that she had breached fiduciary standards through undisclosed self-dealing, and though she had already resigned from her boards, the ruling was entered into public record, making permanent what reputation alone could never repair. Her name, once attached to charity luncheons and preservation committees, now appeared in legal summaries taught at elder law seminars Richard occasionally lectured at. He mailed me a program one afternoon and laughed that my family had become a cautionary precedent.
I
Framed the cover and set it in Harold's study beside the auction catalog.
There was poetry in that.
One document showing what she sold, another showing what it cost her. But the deepest reckoning did not come from institutions. It came from legacy itself refusing to move in the direction greed had planned. 6 months after the hearing, the Lake Cottage title transfer became irrevocable. The scholarship endowment crossed its first $250,000 after donations poured in from people moved by the story, though few knew the full story. Ethan, under trust mentorship, approved the first restoration grant for preserving veteran family archives, honoring Harold in ways even I had not imagined. At the dedication ceremony, Reverend Collins introduced me not as a donor, not as a widow, but as founder. I had not realized until then how completely my position had changed. I was no longer defending what was mine. I was directing what would outlive me. Laura attended quietly, seated near the back as always now, but not in disgrace. In accountability, there is a difference. Yet consequences continued with an almost mathematical symmetry. Daniel's business partnership unraveled when financial disclosures tied to the trust inquiry brought scrutiny to other practices. He settled expensive audits and sold the lake house they once remodeled with stolen confidence. Laura, who had imagined inherited security, spent years repaying what ambition disguised as entitlement had cost. Financially, she was diminished. Socially, she was humbled. Legally, she was marked. Publicly, she had been exposed. Nothing about her fall was theatrical. That made it more satisfying. It was real. One Sunday afternoon she came alone and asked whether I would ever forgive what she had done. I poured tea, from ordinary cups now, and told her forgiveness was not the return of access. It was the refusal to let betrayal own the rest of my life. Then I handed her a copy of the trust charter bearing Ethan's stewardship appointment and said, "This is the future you tried to intercept. Look at who holds it now." She read in silence. Then she smiled faintly through tears and said, "I used to think inheritance meant
Receiving.
Now I know it means proving worthy." It was the first wise thing I had heard her say in years. Later that summer, Mr. Whitmore hosted a gala exhibition of significant family collections and unveiled a plaque beside the Tiffany service crediting proceeds to the Carter Heritage Scholarship. Visitors stopped to read it. Some recognized my name. One elderly woman squeezed my hand and whispered, "They told me my things were worthless too." I only smiled, because I knew the lie beneath those words. Value is never decided by the one trying to strip it from you. On the anniversary of Harold's death, Ethan and I opened the old cabinet and, for the first time since everything began, I placed the surviving teacup on the table and poured coffee into it. We drank in silence. Then he asked whether I ever wished I had simply confronted Laura the day I saw the catalog and ended it quickly. I told him no, because quick anger would have recovered porcelain. Patience recovered a legacy. And that was true. I had not merely won back money. I had secured every major asset, restructured succession, transformed attempted exploitation into scholarship, shifted stewardship to honorable hands, and turned a daughter's betrayal into a public example of consequences. Laura had sold China for $18,000 and lost access to millions, lost standing, lost authority, lost the inheritance she once quietly budgeted. I had kept the house, the trust, the legacy, the final word, and the power to decide what survived me. Months later, when my will was updated one final time, Richard asked whether there were any amendments. I told him only one. Add this sentence to the family statement of intent. No heir shall mistake stewardship for ownership. He smiled and said that sounded less like law than verdict. Perhaps it was both. The last image I keep is simple. Evening light across polished wood. One porcelain teacup under glass. Harold's scholarship letters stacked beside it. And me, no longer a woman anyone could persuade her treasures were unwanted, closing the cabinet doors with steady hands. She thought she sold my china. What she truly auctioned away was her claim to everything she once expected to inherit. And I made certain the world and the record agreed.